Tonight, we explore the life of Abraham Lincoln, the humble rail splitter who became America's 16th president and reshaped a broken nation. From a log cabin in the Kentucky wilderness to the echoes of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's story is one of tragedy, triumph, and a relentless pursuit of unity. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy this kind of calm, reflective storytelling. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes these stories are so engaging, we forget they're meant to help us unwind. Now it's time to dim the lights. Turn on a fan for some quiet background noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight. Together. It all began in the quiet hills of Kentucky on February 12, 1809. In a one-room log cabin near the small town of Hodgenville, a child was born into poverty. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He would grow up to lead a nation, but that future felt impossibly far away as he took his first breaths on the cold, dirt floor of a frontier home. His family was poor, so poor that even candles were a luxury. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a wandering carpenter and farmer, a stern man who worked with his hands and believed in hard labor. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was gentle, warm, and deeply spiritual. From her, Abraham inherited a sense of quiet reflection that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Lincolns moved often, chasing land and opportunity in Kentucky, then across the Ohio River into Indiana. The land was rough. Life was harder. They cleared fields by hand, planted crops, built fences, and tried to survive each winter with just enough to eat. And then, when Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother fell ill with milk sickness, a deadly disease caused by drinking the milk of cows that had eaten a poisonous plant. She died quickly, and the loss shook the family to its core. For Abraham, it left an invisible wound that never quite healed. He would carry that grief quietly, folding it into the melancholy that shaped his personality. But light returned to the Lincoln home when his father married a kind widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. She brought warmth and structure to the family, and she brought books. She saw something in young Abe, something thoughtful and curious. While Thomas Lincoln wanted his son to swing an axe, Sarah encouraged him to open a book, and he did again and again. The boy from the log cabin had no fancy tutors, no fine clothes, and barely any schooling, but he had a burning hunger to learn. In a world that expected him to plow fields and remain forgotten, Abraham Lincoln quietly began to grow, not in size alone, but in spirit. It was a humble beginning, but even the tallest trees come from the smallest seeds, and Lincoln was just beginning to rise. Abraham Lincoln grew up surrounded by silent, deep forests, long winters, and the slow rhythm of frontier life. But inside that silence, something stirred. While other boys swung axes and hunted game, Abraham was often found beneath a tree, a book open in his lap. Lost in a world far from the wilderness, formal education was almost non-existent in the backwoods of Indiana. In total, Lincoln may have had less than a year of traditional schooling, but he didn't let that stop him. He would borrow any book he could get his hands on, sometimes walking miles just to read a few precious pages. The Bible, Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, and later, Shakespeare all became his silent teachers. His stepmother, Sarah, noticed this. She once said that Abraham read all the books he could lay his hands on and would repeat them word for word. She saw something in him that others missed, an almost sacred hunger to understand the world, to make sense of things most boys never even questioned. But life wasn't easy for a boy who read instead of fought. His father, Thomas, didn't fully understand Abraham's obsession with books. He valued hard work, not hard thinking. And while Abraham did his chores splitting rails, hauling water, tending animals, his mind often wandered elsewhere. He dreamed of distant places, of ancient heroes, of justice, honor, and freedom. People noticed how strange he was. He was tall, awkward, and incredibly strong, yet quiet, almost shy. And when he did speak, his words carried a weight beyond his years. His neighbors were baffled by this lanky teen who could quote entire passages of poetry. Then out, the strongest man in the county, but underneath his calm voice and polite manner was a restless energy. Lincoln wasn't satisfied with the life he'd been born into. The log cabin had taught him how to survive, but the books taught him how to think and, more importantly, how to dream. He once wrote, "The things I want to know are in books. My best friend is the man who will get me a book I ain't read." It was in those pages, lit by candlelight, that Abraham Lincoln first began shaping the mind and the heart that would one day guide a nation through its darkest storm, continues, choosing each phrase with patience. But in 1863, standing on a battlefield soaked with blood, he would give a speech that would live forever. The Battle of Gettysburg had been one of the deadliest of the war. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The town was left scarred. The fields turned into graveyards. In November, months after the battle ended, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery. He wasn't the main speaker. That role belonged to a well-known orator who spoke for over 2 hours. Then Lincoln stood up. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and began to speak. His voice was quiet, and the speech lasted barely 2 minutes, just 272 words. No grand gestures, no dramatic flourishes, just clarity, purpose, and poetry. For 47 years ago, he began, reaching back to the founding of the nation. He reminded the crowd and the country that this war was not only about preserving the Union, it was about proving that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It was a promise, a reminder, a challenge. At first, many were silent. Some didn't know what to make of such a short speech. But over time, those words became something more. They were repeated in classrooms, engraved on monuments, and memorized by generations. In a time of chaos, Lincoln offered simplicity. In a time of hatred, he offered dignity. He didn't speak to crush his enemies. He spoke to lift the living, to give meaning to the fallen. The Gettysburg Address wasn't just a speech, it was a turning point, not of the war, but of national identity. Lincoln redefined what it meant to be American, not just united by borders, but united by ideals. He believed words could heal. And with 272 of them, he helped a grieving nation begin to remember what it stood for. By the beginning of 1865, the end of the war was finally in sight. After 4 long bloody years, the Union armies were closing in on the Confederacy. Cities had fallen. Supply lines were collapsing. And with every passing week, the South's resistance began to crumble. But Abraham Lincoln didn't celebrate. He was tired, not just in body, but in soul. The war had aged him. His face was lined, his eyes heavier, his once dark hair now almost entirely gray. Friends and reporters noted how thin he'd become. The burdens of war, death, and national division had carved their weight into his frame. And yet, his focus never shifted. Even as victory approached, he thought not about punishment, but about healing. In his second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, Lincoln spoke not with triumph, but with grace. He didn't gloat. Instead, he offered words of reconciliation, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He said, urging the nation to bind up its wounds and care for those who had suffered on both sides. It was one of his most beautiful speeches, humble and deeply human. Then, on April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had been saved. And slavery, the institution that had divided the country for centuries, was finally ending. Across the North, bells rang and crowds cheered. There was a sense of relief, of cautious hope. People imagined a future of rebuilding, of reunion, began making plans not just to restore the South, but to reimagine what America could become. He would never get the chance. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. As he sat in his theater box, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped in and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the next morning, April 15th, with his wife Mary by his side, and the nation in mourning. He had lived to see the war end, but not the peace that followed. When Abraham Lincoln died, the country didn't just lose a president, it lost its compass. News of his death spread like a cold wind across the nation. In the North, people wept openly in the streets. Church bells rang for hours. Businesses closed. Entire cities went silent. Even those who had once criticized him now spoke of his greatness with reverence. His body was placed in a grand funeral train that journeyed from Washington, D.C., all the way back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. Along the route, thousands lined the tracks, standing in silence as the train passed. Men removed their hats. Women held their children close. It wasn't just mourning, it was a farewell to the man who had held them together during the country's darkest hour. Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, near the town where he had once walked as a young lawyer. The grave would soon be marked by a towering monument, and later still, his face would be etched in stone at Mount Rushmore, printed on currency. But behind all the marble and myths was a man, a real man, one who battled depression, one who knew grief intimately, one who never believed himself to be extraordinary. And yet, he changed everything. Lincoln didn't live to see the full impact of his work. He never saw the Reconstruction struggles, or the long civil rights movement that would come more than a century later. But the seeds he planted in speeches, in laws, in moral clarity continued to grow. He reminded America what it should strive to be, not perfect, but better, not divided but united, not driven by hate or fear, but by compassion, reason, and courage. Today, we remember Lincoln as the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, the man who led with both strength and gentleness. But perhaps what makes him truly great is not just what he did, it's who he was. A boy who read by candlelight, a lawyer who spoke with honesty, a leader who never lost sight of humanity. His life reminds us that greatness doesn't require perfection, only purpose, integrity, and a heart that refuses to turn away from what is right. The Romantic era, when artists and composers became fascinated by ancient myths and warrior cultures, when Richard Wagner composed his famous operas about Norse gods and heroes, costume designers needed a look that matched the drama. They added horns. These theatrical helmets looked powerful on stage. They gave singers a larger-than-life presence. Audiences were thrilled, and from there, the image stuck. Books, paintings, and later Hollywood films embraced it. Horned helmets became a symbol of wild strength, a shortcut for Viking. But real Viking warriors would have found such helmets ridiculous. Horns on a battlefield would have made them easy targets. The horns could catch weapons, get stuck indoors, or throw off balance during a fight. Vikings were practical people. Their gear was designed for survival, not style. That doesn't mean they weren't artistic. Their weapons and armor were often beautifully carved with knotwork and animals. Their ships bore dragon heads. Their jewelry had deep meaning. But when it came to battle, efficiency mattered most. Even so, the myth lives on. In cartoons, in costumes, in football team logos. It's hard to shake such a bold image, even when history tells a different story. But the truth is more interesting than the fiction, because the real Vikings didn't need horns to be terrifying. They had skill, they had strategy, and they had a silence before the storm that no helmet could capture. The Vikings were not just raiders or settlers, they were explorers, restless, curious, and unafraid of the unknown. While much of Europe viewed the sea as a boundary, the Norse saw it as a road, a challenge, yes, but never a wall. Driven by overpopulation, limited farmland, and the promise of riches, Viking explorers pushed beyond the known edges of the map. Their longships, fast, light, and maneuverable, made it possible to go where no one else dared. First, they sailed west to the British Isles, then farther to the wild coast of Ireland and the rocky shores of Scotland. Soon, they discovered the windswept Faroe Islands and, then, a great mist-covered land, Iceland. In the late 9th century, Norse families began settling in Iceland. There, they built farms, established a parliament, and wrote saga stories of gods, ghosts, and heroic voyages. But even Iceland wasn't far enough. By the late 10th century, Eric the Red, a bold and exiled chieftain, set sail from Iceland and reached a vast icy coastline. He named it Greenland, hoping the name would attract settlers. It worked, but the most legendary voyage came next. Around the year 1000, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, set sail even farther west. He landed on a new land, one with forests, grasslands, and grapes. The Norse called it Vinland. Most scholars believe Vinland was part of modern-day Newfoundland in Canada. Leif and his crew built a small settlement, now known as L'Anse aux Meadows, the first known European presence in North America. This happened nearly 500 years before Columbus would sail from Spain, but the Norse presence in Vinland didn't last. Conflict with indigenous peoples, harsh winters, and the distance from home eventually forced them to abandon the settlement. Still, they had come. They had crossed the Atlantic and returned. Their journeys were not just about conquest, they were about possibility. Vikings explored the rivers of Eastern Europe, traded with the Byzantine Empire, and journeyed through deserts and forests in search of something more. They didn't always know where they were going, but they went anyway, in a world bounded by fear. The Norse spirit moved with the tide, ever outward, always wondering what lies beyond. No age lasts forever, not even one. Born on wind and sea. By the middle of the 11th century, the Viking world was changing, slowly at first, then all at once. The raids that once shook the coasts of Europe began to fade. The longships still sailed, but they carried more goods than warriors. The same hands that once gripped axes were now signing treaties, trading furs, and kneeling in prayer. One by one, the old pagan beliefs gave way to Christianity. Missionaries had arrived decades earlier, some as captives, others as guests, and over time, their influence grew. Kings and chieftains began converting, not only for spiritual reasons, but for alliances, legitimacy, and peace with Christian neighbors. With religion came structure, and with structure came kingdoms. On Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, strong central monarchies began to take shape. Local chiefs were replaced by royal law. Raiding gave way to taxes. The wild independence that had once defined Viking society was being reshaped by order. At the same time, European defenses improved. Castles rose along the coastlines. Towns fortified their walls. The element of surprise so crucial to Viking raids was vanishing. The world was simply growing harder for Vikings to thrive in. One of the final chapters came in 1066. A powerful Norse king named Harald Hardrada sailed to England with dreams of reclaiming a throne. He fought bravely at the Battle of Stamford Bridge but was killed in battle. Just weeks later, another invasion came, this time from William, Duke of Normandy, himself a descendant of Vikings. He conquered England, not as a raider, but as a king. The Viking age had come full circle. From seaborne raiders to crowned rulers, from oral myths to written laws. And then the sails faded from the horizon. But while the raids ended, the legacy remained in place names, in languages, in bloodlines, in the fierce independence of Iceland, in the stones carved with runes that still whispered their stories. The age of the Viking had passed, but their spirit, curious and unrelenting, had already changed the world, and some part of that spirit still sails quietly beneath the surface of our history. The sails are gone. The oars have stopped. The longships rest in museums and burial mounds, but the legacy of the Vikings still moves quietly through the world. They left no empire in the traditional sense, no towering ruins or marble temples, and yet their impact is carved deeply into the bones of modern Europe and beyond. In England, over 1,000 towns and villages bear Norse names. Words like knife, sky, window, and berserk come straight from the Old Norse tongue. Even the days of the week: Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, and Friday for Freyr, remind us that the gods of the Vikings still echo in the calendars we live by. In Ireland, cities like Dublin were founded by Norse settlers first, as ports for plunder, then as trading hubs, and finally as thriving medieval communities. In France, the Normans, descendants of Viking settlers, would go on to shape the history of Europe through war and rule, most famously in 1066. When William the Conqueror claimed the English crown. In Iceland, their language survives almost untouched, so close to Old Norse that ancient sagas can still be read aloud with little translation. These sagas, written on parchment in flickering candlelight, preserved the myths, values, and dreams of a people long gone yet never fully forgotten. But their legacy isn't just historical, it's cultural, it's emotional. The Viking spirit of daring, endurance, and curiosity has become a symbol around the world. Books, films, games, and television shows continue to reimagine their stories, often more myth than truth, and yet something remains authentic in their portrayal: the sense of wild freedom, of facing storms head, of crossing boundaries others fear. We remember the Vikings not only for their ferocity, but for their humanity, for being people who lived fully in a world that demanded strength and sacrifice. They were poets and explorers, raiders and rulers, mothers and fathers, storytellers and seekers. The Viking Age may be over, but its waves are still washing upon the shores of our culture gently, reminding us that the sea was never the end of their world. It was only ever the beginning. 1520, Quartz made his move under a moonless sky, rain pouring from the heavens. The Spaniards and their native allies began slipping out of the city, carrying with them what they could: weapons, supplies, and gold. Too much gold, greed slowed them. Armor weighed them down. The causeway's narrow bridges over the lake became bottlenecks. The Aztecs were waiting. From canoes and rooftops, warriors launched their attack. Arrows rained down. Spears pierced the dark. Some Spaniards slipped on the wet stone and fell into the lake, dragged down by their treasures. Others were captured alive. Their fate sealed atop the same pyramids they once marveled at. Courts fought to keep order, but chaos ruled. Bodies filled the water. Screams cut through the rain. In the darkness, no one knew who lived or died. By dawn, the survivors reached the far shore bloodied, broken, and hollow-eyed. Courts sat beneath a tree and wept. This night would be remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Hundreds of Spaniards were dead. Thousands of native allies had perished. The dream of conquest seemed shattered, but it was not the end. Court Eacute regrouped. The survivors limped toward Tlaxcala, where they rested and rebuilt. More allies joined him, drawn by their shared hatred of the Aztec Empire. Though battered, the Spanish still held their guns, their steel, and their deadly resolve. But something else had already entered Tenochtitlan, invisible and far more lethal. While swords clashed and causeways ran red, a single infected man had left behind a legacy far more devastating than gold or fire. Smallpox had arrived, and it would finish what weapons could not. While the Spanish mourned their losses and rebuilt their strength, an invisible invader was already at work inside the heart of the Aztec Empire. Smallpox. It arrived quietly, clinging to the breath and skin of a single infected man, a black slave who had traveled with the Spanish forces. No one noticed at first. A cough, a fever, a rash, but then it spread. Tenochtitlan. Once a city of color, sound, and life began to fall silent. Entire families were wiped out in days. Children, priests, warriors, all struck down without warning. The dead filled homes and temples. The living, too weak to bury them, began to abandon hope. The Aztecs had never seen such a sickness. Their healers were powerless. Their gods offered no relief. Panic set in, followed by despair. As many as half the city's population perished not from battle, but from disease. Among the dead was Cuitlahuac, Montezuma's brother and successor. His reign had lasted only 80 days. The empire, leaderless and reeling, chose a new ruler, a young noble with fire in his spirit and defiance in his heart. Meanwhile, Courts returned stronger than before. He now commanded over 100,000 native allies, including the fierce Tlaxcalans. Too many tribes. The Aztecs had been cruel overlords. Now, they saw a chance to break free, even if it meant siding with the Spaniards. In May 1521, Cortés began the siege of Tenochtitlan. First, he cut off the causeways. Then, with brigantine ships assembled on the lake, he blockaded the waters, severing the city from its food and supplies. Day by day, street by street, the Spaniards and their allies fought their way through the capital. The Aztecs resisted with everything they had, even starving and sick. They fought from rooftops, from canals, from the last sacred spaces of their city. They turned temples into strongholds, maize fields into battlefields, but they could not stop the siege. What the sword had begun, the disease had deepened, and hunger would soon finish. By the time the final assault began, Tenochtitlan was no longer the shining city Courts had first seen. It was a shadow of itself, broken, burning, yet still unwilling to kneel. Not yet. By August of 1521, the city of Tenochtitlan, once a symbol of order, beauty, and divine purpose, had become a graveyard. The canals, that once shimmered with sunlight and trade, now ran dark with filth and blood. The causeways were choked with bodies. The floating gardens wilted in silence. Smoke rose from temples that had stood for centuries. For 93 days, the Aztecs had held on. Hungry, sick, and surrounded, they fought with sharpened stones, obsidian, blades, and sheer will. Their new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, refused to surrender even as his people collapsed from exhaustion. He believed in the sacredness of their cause, but the siege was relentless. Spanish cannons tore through stone walls. Their brigantines ruled the lake. Thousands of native allies overwhelmed the defenders. No help came, no miracle arrived, and finally, on August 13, 1521, the fighting stopped. Cuauhtémoc was captured as he attempted to flee by canoe. Brought before courts, he is said to have spoken with dignity. I have done what was my duty in defense of my people. Now I am your prisoner. Take this dagger and kill me." Court spared him for the moment, perhaps seeing value in a living symbol of conquest. But the city was lost. Tenochtitlan, once home to over 200,000 people, was reduced to ashes and ruins. The temples were looted, sacred texts destroyed. Survivors were enslaved or left to starve among the rubble. The lake, which had once nourished the city, was filled in and buried under the weight of empire. In its place, courts would begin to build Mexico City, a new capital for a new colony laid atop the bones of a fallen civilization. But something had also died in the Spaniards. The wonder they once felt when they first entered the city had been replaced by silence, by scorched stone, by the echoes of what once was. The conquest was over. The victory was complete. And yet, the cost to both conqueror and conquered was immeasurable. The Aztec Empire, with its gods, its beauty, and its contradictions, was no more. But the story, the memory, the weight of it would live on forever.